In the late 20th century, the church witnessed what appeared to be a peculiar and novel phenomenon. Christians started forsaking traditional houses of worship in favor of gathering in vast auditoriums. The once simple gospel lost its allure. Inspirational sermons were discarded, making way for elements reminiscent of the entertainment industry. The music grew louder and more dramatic, with memorable phrases echoing in the minds of congregations long after the services concluded. No longer were sermons solely centered around Jesus or even Christianity. Ministers began to infuse politics into their core doctrines. They skillfully blended elements of populism and anti-establishmentism. These ministers sowed seeds of fear, suggesting that elected government officials were opposing their ministries. According to their narrative, if these officials succeeded, Satan himself would ascend to power. They diligently watered these seeds with current events and international conflicts, asserting that news agencies had verified these apprehensions. Congregants were systematically indoctrinated and manipulated into believing that an imminent threat loomed. By skillfully weaving together eschatology, nationalism, politics, and news of global conflict, ministers successfully convinced unsuspecting followers that their apocalyptic scenarios were unfolding. The world, as they knew it, was about to collapse. Satan and his legion of religious and political demons had infiltrated not only the church, but also the education system and government offices. Many subtle ideologies were introduced in the form of doctrine, each sounding somewhat biblical yet esoteric. Individually, and in their infancy, the doctrines were benign. However, as they became adopted as new canon, these ideologies became increasingly more destructive. Themes of aggression and elitism began to emerge. Sermons no longer encouraged listeners to show kindness to their neighbors. Congregants became polarized against those who did not agree with their pseudo-Christian, openly political, extra-biblical, and esoteric ideas. The nasty cocktail of bad theology painted the picture of a world where the forces of good and evil were constantly at war, then blurred the lines separating the two. New leaders began to emerge, claiming to have prophetic insight into the spirit world. People with itching ears abandoned critical thought in the hype of prophecy, while prophets learned the power of persuasion their supposed visions had over the hearts and minds of their listeners. New ideas were eagerly accepted simply by having the label of prophecy. Children were raised to believe and accept these predictions and ideologies as gospel truth. Worse, they were trained to associate them with key passages from the Bible, altering their perception of Christianity. As adults, they viewed others who accepted their blend of doctrine and scripture as being Christian, while they viewed anyone opposed as an apostate. Many of those adults became elders, preachers, evangelists, and prophets. Having been trained to associate the supposed apostate churches with demonic forces, some of them began to preach against fellow Christians with opposing views. With the proverbial line drawn in the sand, they had effectively severed themselves from the Christian church. A new breed of Christianity emerged, one that bore little resemblance to its ancestry. During its early formation, it hardly resembled a unified movement. Several disconnected and even opposing groups of Christians were simultaneously influenced by evangelists and prophets during revivals and conventions under the guise of open door or the interdenominational fellowship. Bad theology was injected into unsuspecting groups of Christians who had otherwise adopted sound teaching. Extra-biblical doctrines associated with recurring social political themes continued to develop. They spread like a virus, especially among groups that had replaced the gospel with more entertaining forms of worship and teaching. As a result, identifying the churches or groups infected with the destructive theologies became increasingly difficult. Unless a particular group progressed into extremism, they were viewed only as eccentric or overzealous. Groups that adopted only a handful of the extra-biblical doctrines, though viewed as unorthodox and unusual, remained relatively harmless. However, those who favored the extra-biblical over the core precepts of Scripture continued to become more dangerous and, in certain cases, deadly. It wasn't until a group began to edge closer towards a climactic event that they were recognized as destructive. Due to the disconnected and unstructured nature of the movement as it formed, Christian historians struggled to understand the connection between groups that had become isolationists or displayed unhealthy characteristics. Even after a particular group developed into a destructive cult and came to a tragic end, sparking legal, criminal, and historical investigations, the connections to the ideological framework were often overlooked. Since some core doctrines had shifted after the central figures of the destructive groups severed themselves from their respective denominations of faith, it was mistakenly assumed that the destructive qualities came after the separation. The underlying architecture of bad theology that enabled the destructive central figures was overlooked. It wasn't until years later that examiners of the movement began to notice patterns and similarities between individual groups. Many leaders of the movement were very charismatic, though only some had emerged directly from the charismatic movement. Others were either Pentecostal or had been strongly influenced by modern Pentecostalism. Some of the groups proudly described their historical lineage to men and women that they considered to be God's generals, whom they claimed to be heroes of the faith. Others, aware that some of the people classified as generals were unsavory characters, unethical and even criminal, tried to conceal their lineage from congregants and especially from outsiders. Beliefs that outsiders were subservient were common among groups within the movement, and over time, that belief was openly stated under the title of dominionism. Elements of the political ideologies that had fused with Christianity became very evident within the movement when leaders began proclaiming the Seven Mountain Mandate. Members were instructed to use any means possible to influence family, religion, education, media, arts and entertainment, business and government, just as their political ancestors had attempted through various political schemes. The political agenda of the movement became even more transparent when key leaders within the group openly declared their allegiance and support of their political candidates, and those candidates leveraged the support of those same religious leaders to secure votes. Eventually, the movement was given the title New Apostolic Reformation, a term coined by one of the early influencers of the group, C. Peter Wagner. Wagner, his supportive contemporaries, and countless others in the lineage of the movement taught members to believe that a reformation was possible through spiritual warfare. Some early proponents of the movement mistakenly assumed that spiritual warfare simply meant engaging in prayer for a positive outcome. However, as the movement continued to polarize its views of outsiders, the meaning of the word warfare became more and more obscure. Converts to the New Apostolic Reformation included a wide variety of groups, some of which leaned heavily towards extremism. From Christian identity and Christian nationalist groups to health and prosperity gospel televangelists and their cult followers, the NAR suddenly emerged as a network of vastly different people. Yet when compared to traditional Christianity, all of them could be considered extremist. Eventually, the NAR network was branded the Christian Taliban. While the term New Apostolic Reformation is relatively new, the weaponization of religion for political purposes to oppress groups of people deemed subordinate to another is as old as history has been recorded. In the ancient world, the union of politics and religion was deeply embedded into the identity of entire kingdoms of people. It would not seem unusual for a network of religious extremists to break down the walls separating church and state. In fact, to the non-Christian ancients, it would seem normal and heroic. However, the NAR, as it developed in the modern world, was far from what ancient Christians would consider to be heroic or even as Christian. Leaders of the Dominion theology began to expound on their doctrine, including predictions of violence. Some groups went as far as predicting a coming purge enacted by NAR converts. Of all the parents and grandparents of the NAR, Christian identity is by far the most interesting. While most members of the NAR unknowingly combine their blend of politics and religion to form their identity, the early adherents of the Christian identity movement openly identified with that same union. Without the Christian identity component, the NAR could never have developed in such a way that members could be compared to the Taliban, an Islamic nationalist group linked to terrorism. One could go so far as to say that to understand the NAR and how it developed, one must first understand the history of Christian identity. And while the history of identity itself is somewhat exclusive to the racial and cultural issues of the United States, its predecessor, British Israelism, was not. For a look inside the mindset of an elitist group such as the NAR, that, while claiming to be Christian, viewed other Christians as subordinate or inferior, one must go back in time to Scotland, when Robert the Bruce fought to restore Scotland to an independent kingdom.